Hi everyone, this is Professor Zafari, and in this video I wanted to talk a little bit about critical thinking and the educated person. Critical thinking is something that as college students we're constantly trying to develop. And critical thinking is actually a lifelong process that ideally enhances your life and allows you to think things more clearly, enhances your educational goals as well as your professional goals. And what's important to note is that our human default is to believe things. So it is these fallacies of belief that we want to be aware of from the outset. It's true because I believe it. It's true because we believe it. It's true because I want to believe it. It's true because I've always believed it. It's true because it's in my selfish interests to believe it. This is kind of our human default. So it is not to be critical of who we are, but it's important to be aware that this is our tendency. And it serves a purpose in a way. It's much easier to connect to people if we're more willing to believe them. But it's not necessarily the most valid information. And it's not necessarily the most correct information or the correct reasoning. So what we want to do as critical thinkers then is to be aware of those fallacies, to be aware of our tendencies to believe ideas, and to work past those fallacies. So what we're referring to when we talk about critical thinking is the process of problem solving, the process of analyzing information, interpreting information, recognizing bias, understanding diverse points of view, applying information, and of course learning. So critical thinking is something that you would use in math classes or accounting classes as you problem solve and analyze information. It's what a lawyer uses constantly as they're analyzing different pieces of evidence and they're trying to recognize the bias that each witness has as they bring to the case. The judge has to look at all of these diverse points of view. And so as a student and as a professional, critical thinking skills are something that are going to enhance our life. So there's some specific traits that strong critical thinkers have. And these are the traits we want to talk more about in this video and that we want to work on developing in this course. The first one is intellectual integrity. And then there's intellectual perseverance, confidence in reason, fairness and objectivity, and intellectual courage. So what we mean by intellectual integrity is to be true to one's own disciplined thinking and to holding oneself to the same standards that you expect others to meet. So what we mean then is that you and you alone know the standard of excellence that you try to achieve when you are engaging in thinking. And so with intellectual integrity then, what you're trying to do is meet your own standards. And it's really not about making an A. It's really not about earning somebody's approval. It's really about living up to your own standards. Intellectual integrity. And with intellectual perseverance, it takes a lot of work to live up to those standards. And it takes a lot of work, and it's often frustrating and complicated to do that kind of critical thinking. It's much easier to simply believe what we're told or to simply believe what the first instinct that we have. That's much easier. But strong critical thinkers are willing to get past those frustrations, to accept that problems are complicated, and they're willing to persevere, to keep trying and to keep developing their critical thinking. And all of this is based on the idea that reason, human ability to reason, is ultimately a faculty that can not only improve our individual lives, but can also improve our societies and communities as a whole. So confidence in reason. And here we can see a strong parallel to the allegory we've just read by Plato. In the allegory of the cave, Plato is presenting this story of people, the cave dwellers, who are living in a very a very restricted situation, and so they're very much limited to fallacies of belief, if we want to use that same phrase. And it's when the people in the cave, those few individuals who leave the cave and they're blinded, it's very difficult to see and to start thinking critically initially. That's what we were referring to with intellectual perseverance. But when they start to be able to adjust to the sunlight and to use their reason for themselves, there then develops this confidence that reason is a very useful tool. And when we have confidence in reason, and we are confident that people can learn to think for themselves, that people can form insightful viewpoints, and people can think clearly and accurately, then it's going to be a beneficial thing for everyone. This takes intellectual courage. Again, let's go back to the allegory of the cave. When those cave dwellers left the cave and went out into the sunlight, they explored the world, they used their reason, and when they came back to the cave, they were treated as if they were crazy. And so it takes intellectual courage to be willing to stand by your ideas, even when this is painful. And even if society considers our ideas dangerous or considers our ideas absurd. So it is something that a strong critical thinker has to work on, intellectual courage. And I think the best example of people who had intellectual courage are those people who in the early 20th century here in America fought for racial equality. Based on their own reason, based on their intellectual integrity and perseverance, they came to the view that it is not reasonable to treat people of different races differently. And they come to that conclusion then, but it takes a lot of courage to stand by that idea when most of society does not agree with you. So these are the main characteristics of strong critical thinkers. And as I said, this is a process. Critical thinking is a lifelong process. It's not something that we learn, we master, and we're done. We've learned to ride a bicycle, so for the rest of our life we'll know how to ride a bicycle. It doesn't work that way. We're constantly in process of developing our critical thinking skills. So the first stage of an unreflective thinker, of somebody who's working to develop their critical thinking skills, is that person who doesn't recognize, doesn't notice that they're always making assumptions, that they're forming ideas without any solid evidence, that they are basically following their own egocentric tendencies, that they're basically just going along with what their instinct tells them, those fallacies of belief, and they're not taking the time to recognize how self-centered and prejudiced their initial ideas are. The second stage of development is that challenged thinker who starts to notice that we make those assumptions, who starts to notice those fallacies of belief, who starts to notice that often we make inferences that don't have any evidence, and often that we make important implications in our thought that we really don't have any evidence to support. So the stage 2 thinker developing their critical thinking skills is now aware, is now noticing those fallacies of belief. The third stage is the thinker who is really beginning to apply their reason more carefully. This is the person who's analyzing logic, who's clearly and precisely articulating questions. This is not a person who thinks they know or who thinks they can analyze everything perfectly. This is the person who now knows how to pinpoint the questions well, who knows how to look for information and accuracy, who will distinguish between whether they're given correct information or whether they're just being given someone else's ideas. This is the stage 3 thinker. The stage 4 thinker is the practicing thinker. This is not the master thinker, because there's never a master thinker. We're always in a stage of development and practice. But this is the thinker then who has really internalized their intellectual standards. They have articulated for themselves what their standards of intellectual excellence are, and they're always trying to achieve them. And sometimes perhaps they keep a journal to help them keep their focus on their goals and their intellectual standards. And sometimes they recognize that it has shaped their character, or it helps them deal with their ego. And often it helps you redefine the way you see things. And these influences can have an impact on your life. So the practicing thinker is one who is constantly trying to develop these skills. And in the class here, the exemplary student who's really trying to be that practicing critical thinker often raises important questions, often is analyzing the key questions, recognizing their assumptions, clarifying key concepts. They're identifying relevant competing points of view. They're identifying that different ideas we're going to learn about are not necessarily compatible. And they're demonstrating a commitment to reason carefully. They're trying to be really careful in doing this well. So in conclusion, what I would really like to inspire you to do is to be one of those practicing critical thinkers. And again, it's not easy. Our natural default is to assume that things are the way that we initially assume they are. Those fallacies of belief. It's not easy. It takes intellectual perseverance. It takes confidence in reason, and it takes intellectual courage. But what I would argue is that it will make your life better. It will make you a more successful student. It will make you a more successful professional. So in this class, what I will hope will happen is that we'll get to examine some main ideas that have really shaped the Western world, and we'll get to analyze them. And I'm not interested in this class in how many details you memorize, but it's really those key questions, and that we develop our skills to analyze those concepts and key questions. Those are the skills that I really hope we gain throughout the semester.